Hey guys, welcome to Indie Game Hustle. My name is Charles, and in this video, we're going to, of course, continue the platforming game. And the last video, we kind of set up UModeler to start working, and then we created some spaces here for our enemies, and then a couple of, as you can see, some individual spaces here and here. And we're going to use these to create a spawn point for our player. So generally speaking, for this video, we're going to create a spawn point for the player. We're going to create a checkpoint, and then we're going to trigger the death of the player to make sure that everything is kind of working. So let's see if we can get through that. All right. So in this case, so the first thing I'm going to need to do to create a spawn player is basically create a trigger. Okay. And what we want to do is, I don't necessarily want a player in the scene. I've had videos in the past where I've had a player in my scene, in each individual scene, waiting to be teleported to a location. But I'm thinking, what if we can instantiate a player in the scene when the scene starts? And on top of that, instantiate them to a particular location. All right. So the first thing we got to think about is simple, simple, simple. We just want to instantiate them to a specific location. So to do that, I'm going to create a trigger. Okay. All right. So we have our player here. I'm going to create a trigger, and this trigger is going to do a couple things. So this trigger is on start. We need it to do something, right? So we need this trigger to instantiate. Okay. All right. So that's what we're going to do. All right. So what we're going to do is do a action. And we're going to go to add action, and we're going to go in for instantiate, and you see it right there. All right, great. So now we have a instantiate. We want to put a prefab in here, or a game object in this spot. Now, of course, we can just drop like an object there, but what we need is a prefab because we need our player. Now, I was playing around with it before, so I'm going to actually delete this prefab and show you. All right, so all you got to do is take your player and drag it to the project folder, and it's going to create the prefab that way. That's how I typically do that. Now, once you do that, you can simply delete the player in this scene just like that. Okay. And then you have your player here as a prefab. Okay. All right. So for instance, and just for an example, if you ever run into an issue and you put it out here and you're like, oh, I want to do that over, what you can do is you can right click on this player and you can actually just do unpack prefab completely, and then you have everything the way it was before. All right, so that's fine. So I have my prefab here, right? So I have my trigger and I have my action. So what I want to do is take this prefab and I want to drop that prefab right there. All right, great. All right, so what I'm going to do is move this trigger somewhere. So this is a spawner, right? So this is kind of like we're going to spawn something here. All right, and I'm going to move it up into a position. So I'm going to put it, I'll just put it right here. All right, so great. All right, so now we have this little section or this little object, and now we need something else. We need a marker because we need to place the player at a position. So I'm going to add a marker by going to the game creator toolbar here, and that arrow, that yellow arrow, just go ahead and click that while you have the trigger selected. And I'm going to select that marker and I'm going to move it down. Okay, just like so. All right. All right, so now we have that marker there. I'm going to go back to my action. And so it has a position. So the initial location, we're going to change this to be a transform. And then I'm going to change it to marker. So I'm going to basically click and drag that marker into that position or at that location. All right. Great. So now let's rethink. So now what we have is a trigger on start. So when this scene starts, it's going to have an action, and this action is going to instantiate a player to this location when this scene starts. All right, so let's just see that that works. All right, so I'm going to hit play. And let's just make sure that is working. All right, great. All right, so it's great. So now our player was instantiated to the location where that trigger is, okay? And of course, now if we take this trigger and we move it anywhere else in the scene. So if I pop this puppy way over here in the middle of everything and I hit play, our player should be in that location. Okay. All right, great. So that's where that's at. All right, great. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and move that back over here because we are not done just yet. All right, so now that we have a spawn player working, we're going to have to change it just a little bit because I'm going to need a variable to know where to spawn. So you can imagine in any particular game, or at least in a platforming game, there might be a couple of different spawn points within the same scene. So we're going to need to know which one to send the player to. Okay, so we're going to probably need a variable, right? And this variable is going to be a number. And this number will kind of dictate which spawn point to go to. And the way that the spawn point will know where is that we're going to have to use a condition to say, hey, if this number is 0, put them here. If this number is 1, put them there. And so let's do that. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Game Creator, Preferences, and let me just go ahead and bring over my Preferences window. I'm going to go to Variables, and then I'm going to go here, and I'm going to type in the word spawn point, right? And that's going to be my variable that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go spawn point, and I'm going to hit the plus key, and I'm going to change the type to number. Okay, and I'm going to leave this number at 0. All right, for now. All right, so I'm going to move this off the screen for a second. All right, and then I'm going to go back to my trigger here. And we're going to rename this, and I'm going to rename it to dash spawn point. Or actually, I'm going to name it player spawn. That's what I'm going to name it, player spawn. All right. And so what I'm going to need is a condition instead of this action that we created, because the action was just to show that we can instantiate. So now I'm going to click on conditions, and in my conditions, I'm going to move this up a little. All right. And so in my condition, I'm going to need a clause, and this clause is going to basically say if the spawn point number, basically our variable. So if the variable number, and the one we're going to choose is spawn point, if this is equal to a number, so in this case 0, we need to put this player at a position, right? So at a certain location. Now, we already had an action created, so we can use that same action. Let me go back to my trigger, and I'm actually going to delete this particular slot. But that doesn't delete the action that we created. So I'm going to go back to my condition, and I'm going to take this actions here, and I'm going to click and drag it here. All right. So again, our condition is if this variable equals a number, then we want to instantiate the player to this marker. Okay, so this marker meaning marker 3, at least that's the name that is currently set to, 3. Okay, so, all right, so that technically should work. Now, again, looking at our variables, that is the number 0, and then the spawn number here that we have set is 0. All right, so what I'm going to do is just making sure that this is still working properly. I'm going to go ahead and hit play and make sure that this condition is working. So I'm gonna hit play, and he should spawn here. All right, great. So our player is definitely spawning, right where it says 0 was, right? And that's perfect. All right, so next thing we want to do is check to make sure that the spawn point variable and everything is working. So what I'm going to do now is create a second spawn point. So to do that, I'm just going to simply select this one. I'm going to do a Control D, and I'm going to move it over here. Okay. All right, great. And so with this one, I'm going to go into the conditions of the second one that I just created. So I'll rename this one to spawn point 0, and this one be spawn point 1. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go to conditions, and I'm going to change this value to 1. Okay. All right. So this value should be 1, and the other one is going to be 0. And then in terms of the marker, because we duplicated it, it should be the same marker. But if you want to just make sure that it's going to the right place, you can simply take this marker and drag it in there. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and our player still should be going here because our variable currently says 0. Okay. So I'm going to hit play. We're just going to make sure that that's working. All right, perfect. All right, so our variable is still working there. So we're going to change the variable to 1. And now when I change this variable to 1, our player should show up right here. So I'll hit play and see. All right, and here we go. Perfect. All right, so now our player is here. So based on this variable that we just changed, whatever that variable is, that's where our player is going to instantiate, and that's where he's going to start. All right, and so that's really good. So I'm going to go ahead and move this off the screen here. All right, great. So now that we have that set up, what do we need to do now? So we can't change the variable every time we want to change it, right? We need the player to, I guess, initialize that change, just like, like a real game. When you cross a certain section in the game, that player is now going to be associated with that location. So basically we need to create a checkpoint. And so how do we tell this particular spawn point that you're the new checkpoint, right? So what we can do is create a trigger that simply changes the variable based on where we put the trigger. All right. So what I'm going to do now, there's a couple different ways we can do this, right? We can have the spawn point itself be the change. So we can also add it. But what I'm going to do is separate it. And I'm going to go right click game creator trigger. Okay. And this is going to be the trigger. And I'm going to move this up. And I'm going to put it over somewhere in this area. Okay, for now. All right, and so what we want to do is basically when a player enters into this sphere, we've done this before. When a player enters into the sphere, we need to change or have an action to change something. So I'm going to go click the trigger, and I'm going to go to object, and I'm going to do on player enter. Okay. Now, we need an action. So I'm going to go action. You can either double click here or you can simply select it here. And what I want to do now is change that variable to to something else. So I'm going to hit this, and then we're going to variables, and I'm going to go variable number. We're going to select spawn point. And so now I'm going to change this to, I'm going to leave it at 1. So I'll leave this at 1. So now when the player runs into this particular trigger, it will change the variable to 1. Now we're going to make sure this is always set to 0. Okay, so this we're going to make sure is 0. Okay, all right. So next thing we need to do is just go ahead and make the radius of this larger. And ideally we would want this to be, I guess, as large as the area that it is covering. So if you have an area, so say the player is going from, let's say, I'm going to select this and say, I'm going to copy, paste, and bring this over here. So if the player is going in this direction, we obviously want to make sure that the player cannot bypass the checkpoint because that would be bad. That would be actually very bad. So, so basically, let's go ahead and check that out. All right, so we have our trigger, and I can change this from a sphere to anything I want. So in this case, maybe it's better to be a cube or a box collider. So we're going to do a box collider. All right. And I can right click or click on these dots here. I can move it up above the trigger, and I can remove this sphere collider. Right. And so now we have this box collider, which is nice. And I can go ahead and make that as wide and as large as I need it, right? And then I'll just go ahead and make it deeper. So this ensures, without a doubt, that our player will enter this cube at one point or another if he goes in this direction. Okay, so that's what we want, right? So I'll just make sure that that lines up like so. Great. All right, so again, let's go ahead and test to see if our variable is going to change when we do that. All right, and so what I'll do is go ahead and move over this here so you can see that change as well. All right, so now we have our player. And so now I'm gonna go ahead and walk. All right, so now you can see that the variable number is 0. And of course, I messed up, but we can go ahead and do that. So if you ever run into a wall here, the simple issue here, of course, is that we did not set our box collider to be a trigger. So I'll go ahead and make sure that that's a trigger. Okay, I've done that so many times. All right, so let's see here. All right, so let that load up. All right, and so we'll do it again. So we're gonna go, and as soon as we move over here, it's a number 1. All right, that's good. That's a good thing. All right, and so now we know for a fact that that spawn point is changing, or that check, I guess the checkpoint is changing the number, which in turns our spawn point would know if the scene were to reload, it would send us to that location as opposed to 0. Okay. All right. Now there is something I want you to recognize. In your variables, there's a small little box that doesn't say anything, but it's super important. You see this box here? Click that box. When you click this box, that means that if this game were to change scenes, or if you were to reload the game, it's going to save it in the player prefs of the game. Okay, and we can go into that later. But for now, just know that you want to make sure that this checkbox is checked and that it says saved next to this particular variable. Okay. All right, great. All right, so I'm going to move this to the side. All right, so now we have our player spawn. We have a checkpoint, and the checkpoint is simply changing a number for our spawn point to recognize where to put the player. So to make sure that this is all working, I think the next thing I want to do is create a mechanic, I guess, for our player to die. So we need kind of like a condition for our player to die. All right. So now what I'm going to do to test all this out, and I'm going to go ahead and rename this trigger now. I'm going to call it checkpoint. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is go to my player. And what we have to do now, since our player is not in our scene, you want to select the player here and double click on the prefab. And so now it's kind of a new feature, I would say. And so now we're inside the prefab portion of this. And so what we want to do is go into our mechanics just like before. And we're going to go ahead and add an additional trigger here. And so what I want to do is go to mechanics, right click, and I'm going to create a trigger. And we're going to just go ahead and rename it to death. I feel so bad naming it death, but it is what it is. It is his death trigger. All right. And so now we need to set this up. So what do we need to do? We need to do this. We need to go to change trigger. We need to know when his health is going to decrease. And that's what we need. We need this trigger to recognize when the health is decreasing, do a thing, right? So what I'll do is I'll go to stats, and in stats, it says on attribute change. So this trigger is going to trigger itself based on whether or not the attribute is changing, okay? So we're gonna go player as the target, and the attribute is health, and then on change, we can do on change, or we can do on decrease. We would want this to be on decrease, okay? All right, and so now what we need to do is on decrease, we need to do a condition. All right. And so now when I select condition, what are we checking for? So we need to check to see if our variable, our attribute health is less than or equal to 0. So basically, if our health is 0, he's dead. If it's less than 0, he's dead. And so basically, that's going to help it know how to dictate that, right? So this is pretty simple, right? So next, we need to do some actions as to what to do when this happens. Now, this is going to change as we progress through this platforming game series thing here. And so for now, we're kind of just testing to make sure everything is working. So what we want to happen is when the health reaches 0 or below, we need to say player has died. Okay. And then once the player has died, I want to put a wait in there. So I want to wait for like 3 seconds, right? And then after 3 seconds, maybe we can have it change the scene to the same scene. And the reason we're changing the scene to the same scene is because we're thinking, because we have our spawn point variable, that variable is saved and it's been saved. It's been set to a particular number and it should be based on that. So let's go ahead and do it. All right. So we're going to create an action. The first action is I'm going to just do a simple message. Now we could do a debug message, but I'm just going to go ahead and do a regular simple message. All right. And this message is going to simply say player died. Okay. All right. And so that's fine. So my next action is going to be a wait. I want to wait for about 3 seconds before we change the scene. All right. So we're going to do another action and we're going to type in the word sc scene, basically. Right. And we're going to load the scene. In the scene, I don't know what your name is, but the name that I have for this particular scene is going to be underscore capital BSE. So underscore base. So whatever the name of this current scene is, you want to name it to that. Okay. And then we just want to leave these things alone for now. All right. So hopefully this is going to do what we need it to do. All right. So I'm going to click this arrow here. And remember, we're in the prefab. So we're going to click this arrow here. And so now all of those things that we created is going to be in the prefab of that player. All right, so let's take a look. Now, I already know there's probably going to be one issue, and I wanted to see if that's going to be the case every time. And it also helps for you to kind of see it so that we know how to identify it. All right, let's see here. So now we have our player. And we should, when his health decreases, hopefully it works properly. All right. One more hit. Can we get another hit? Oh. Player died. Okay. And 3, 2, 1. Boom. All right. So great. So now we return to the last spawn point that we had set up. Okay. And that's good. That's exactly what we wanted. But our health is completely at 0 right now. And we're going to need to fix all of those things. But let's verify a couple things. So I'm going to go over to this spawn point. I'm going to hit play. And I'm going to now walk over to the other spawn point. And I'm going to bring this over here so that we can kind of see how everything works together. All right. So I'm going to walk over here. When we click into this or walk into this section, we're going to do, this is our checkpoint space. Boom. So 1. So that should be good, right? And that is saved as well. So now when we go die, all right, and we're going to get hit by pretty much these guys. And he takes off a bit more. Player died. Wait for 3 seconds. 2, 1, boom. All right. And so now we're at the other spawn point, right? The other checkpoint, and that is working properly. And that's pretty good. That's not bad. That's a good starting point, I think, for us to get going with this, and that's pretty awesome. All right, and of course, there's other things we have to address, like our health is at 0, and we need to address that because our player is dead. We're going to want to make sure that our player's health is filled back up. We're also going to talk about in the next few videos about player lives, right? So, just like in a classic platforming game, a player might have 3 or 4 or 5 lives. So we want this player to have lives as well. So not just health, but also lives. And so we're going to talk about that in the next few videos. I hope that was useful. And I guess I will see you guys in the next video. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. To stay up to date on the latest 3D platforming tutorial, feel free to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support, you can find me on Patreon, or of course you can hit me up on Discord. I like to talk about whatever project you guys are working on. Of course, thanks for hanging with me. Your support is always appreciated. As always, remember, never give up and keep moving forward. Peace.